High above Europe, where the air thins and the horizon bends into a pale blue curve, pilots entered a realm where human error was measured in seconds. Engines strained for oxygen, hands numbed inside gloves, and survival depended not only on skill but on whether the machine beneath you could still breathe. By the final months of World War II, Germany was running out of almost everything: fuel, trained pilots, time. Yet in the middle of that collapse, one aircraft emerged with a singular purpose: to fight where no other piston engine fighter could. The Focke-Wulf FW H-1 was not designed for dogfights over treetops or desperate chases at low altitude. It was built for the edge of the sky. At heights above 40,000 feet, where most fighters lost their power and pilots their consciousness, the FW H-1 was still accelerating. Its speed at extreme altitude shocked Allied test pilots after the war and puzzled historians ever since. How did a late-war German fighter built in tiny numbers, under desperate conditions, achieve such performance? The answer lies in a combination of radical wing design, an unusually complex supercharger system, chemical power boosters, and a cockpit pressurized long before such features became standard. But the deeper question remains: was the FW H-1 a glimpse of the future of air combat, or a brilliant solution to a problem that never truly arrived? By 1943, the air war over Europe had changed fundamentally. The struggle was no longer decided by turning fights between fighters, but by altitude, endurance, and industrial scale. American heavy bombers B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds were now pushing deep into German airspace, typically operating around 25,000 feet, while their fighter escorts often flew even higher, waiting to dive down with superior energy. For Germany, this created a growing and dangerous gap. The Focke-Wulf F190A series, formidable at low and medium altitudes, began to lose effectiveness above roughly 20,000 feet. Its performance dropped sharply as it climbed, leaving German interceptors struggling to reach, let alone fight, bomber formations protected by Allied fighters. This was not a minor inconvenience, it was a strategic flaw. German planners also feared what might come next. Intelligence reports suggested that the United States was developing a new generation of bombers, faster and capable of operating even higher. The aircraft in question was the B-29 Superfortress. Although it never bombed Germany, at the time this was unknown. The assumption was simple and alarming. Future bombers would fly higher, faster, and beyond the reach of existing interceptors. The response from Focke-Wulf was not an incremental improvement, but a fundamentally different aircraft. Under the direction of Kurt Tank, the company pursued a fighter optimized almost exclusively for extreme altitude. The result was the Focke-Wulf FW-152, and specifically the FW-152 H-1, the high-altitude variant that would become the only version to reach limited production. From the beginning, the design philosophy was clear. This was not meant to replace the W190 across the board. It was a specialist. The FW-152 H-1 would sacrifice low-altitude speed and agility in exchange for dominance where the air was thin and engines gasped for power. Every major design choice reflected this priority. At sea level, the FW-152 H-1 was fast, but not exceptional by late-war standards. Many Allied fighters could outrun it down low. But as altitude increased, the equation changed. Where other fighters plateaued and then declined, the FW-152 H-1 continued to gain speed. This was not accidental. It was the product of a carefully engineered power plant, an unusually advanced supercharger system, and an airframe built to exploit thin air rather than fight against it. Equally important was the strategic role envisioned for the aircraft. German planners imagined FW-152 Hone second loitering thousands of feet above bomber streams, beyond the reach of escorting fighters. From that perch, they would dive at extreme speed, destroy a bomber with heavy cannon fire in a single pass, and then climb back into safety. It was a clean, clinical concept, one that relied on altitude as both weapon and shield. Whether that vision matched reality would depend on technology, timing, and resources, three things Germany was rapidly running out of. But on paper, the concept was sound, and the machine built to execute it was unlike any piston engine fighter that came before. The true strength of the FW-152 H-1 reveals itself only as the aircraft climbs. At low altitude, its performance appears unremarkable by late-war standards, but this fighter was never meant to shine near the ground. Its battlefield was the upper atmosphere, and every 1,000 feet gain tilted the balance further in its favor. At sea level, the FW-152 H-1 reached roughly 358 miles per hour, respectable, but hardly extraordinary in 1945. As it climbed, however, speed increased steadily. Thinner air reduced drag, and the aircraft's supercharger worked to maintain engine power. Around 6,500 feet, the first limits of the system appeared, and performance briefly plateaued as manifold pressure began to fall. This is where the engineering philosophy of the Ta-152 H-1 became evident. Unlike most fighters of the era, its Jumo 213A engine was paired with a dual-stage supercharger equipped with 3 distinct gear speeds. When the second speed engaged, power recovered, and by 7,000 meters, about 23,000 feet, the aircraft was pushing past 430 miles per hour. At this altitude, it was already competitive with the best Allied escorts. The third supercharger speed marked the beginning of the aircraft's dominance. Engaged above roughly 23,000 feet, it allowed the engine to continue producing usable power where most piston fighters were already running out of breath. At 9,500 meters, the Ta-152 H-1 reached approximately 454 miles per hour, making it faster than nearly every Allied fighter operating at that height. But the design did not stop there. At extreme altitude, even the most advanced supercharger system eventually reaches its limits. To push beyond them, German engineers turned to a chemical solution. The GM1 system, which injected nitrous oxide into the engine's intake, effectively added oxygen to the combustion process. When activated above 37,000 feet, GM1 provided a critical boost, just as aerodynamic and mechanical limits threatened to cap performance. With GM1 engaged, the Ta-152 H-1 could exceed 460 miles per hour at altitudes above 40,000 feet. In this regime, only one Allied piston engine fighter, the P-47M Thunderbolt, could even approach its performance, and only for short bursts, before exhausting its water methanol supply. The Ta-152 H-1, by contrast, could sustain high power for extended periods, giving it a decisive endurance advantage. This combination of speed, altitude, and persistence defined the aircraft's peak capability. It was not a machine designed for swirling dogfights or prolonged engagements. Instead, it embodied a vertical form of warfare: climb above the enemy, strike with overwhelming energy, and escape upward before retaliation was possible. In those rare moments when theory met reality, the Ta-152 H-1 demonstrated what late-war piston technology could achieve when pushed to its absolute limits. It was a fighter operating at the edge of physics and, in many ways, at the edge of its era. At extreme altitude, even the most advanced mechanical systems begin to fail. Air becomes so thin that no amount of gearing or impeller efficiency can fully compensate. For the Ta-152 H-1, this moment arrived above roughly 37,000 feet, where even its sophisticated supercharger system was nearing the limits of what physics would allow. It was here that the aircraft's most unusual feature came into play. The solution was the GM1 system, short for Göring-Mischung, a method of injecting nitrous oxide into the engine's intake. Unlike water methanol injection, which suppresses detonation at high manifold pressures, GM1 addressed a different problem entirely: the lack of oxygen. At extreme altitude, the engine was not starved for fuel or cooling, but for air itself. Nitrous oxide offered an elegant workaround. Stored as a liquid in a compact tank behind the cockpit, it vaporized when released, providing additional oxygen to the combustion process without the impractical storage requirements of pure oxygen. When activated, GM1 restored lost power at precisely the altitude where conventional systems became ineffective. For the Ta-152 H-1, this translated into a renewed surge of speed, an increase of roughly 35 kilometers per hour at heights where most fighters were already struggling to remain airborne. This capability came with trade-offs. GM1 was not intended for continuous use in combat below extreme altitude, and its benefits were tightly linked to a narrow operational window. The system added complexity, weight, and logistical burden to an aircraft already built under desperate wartime conditions. Documentation on its exact configuration remains fragmentary, and pilots likely had some discretion in when and how it was employed, at the cost of increased engine wear. Yet even with these limitations, the impact was profound. With GM1 engaged, the Ta-152 H-1 could operate above 40,000 feet at speeds unmatched by any other piston engine fighter in sustained flight. In this environment, Allied escorts such as the P-51 Mustang or late-war Spitfires simply could not follow. Even the formidable P-47M could only contest this space briefly before exhausting its boost reserves. The broader consequence of this design philosophy, however, was strategic isolation. The Ta-152 H-1 was optimized for a battle that rarely occurred. By the time it reached service, Allied bomber formations were not operating at the extreme altitudes the aircraft was built to dominate. Combat records suggest that when Ta-152 seconds did engage enemy aircraft, it was often at much lower heights, where their unique advantages were diminished. In the end, the Ta-152 H-1 became a symbol of late-war German aviation, technically brilliant, narrowly specialized, and tragically out of step with reality. Its performance at the edge of the atmosphere was undeniable, but the war below had already moved on. From an Allied perspective, the Ta-152 H-1 represented an unusual and narrowly focused threat. American and British fighter doctrine emphasized flexibility aircraft that could escort bombers, fight at medium altitude, and still perform effectively closer to the ground. In contrast, the Ta-152 H-1 was a specialist, designed to dominate a thin slice of the sky that Allied aircraft rarely needed to occupy. When compared directly, the differences were stark. The P-51 Mustang, even when running high-octane fuel, was optimized for range and efficiency rather than extreme altitude. At low and medium heights, it could outrun and outmaneuver the Ta-152 H-1, but above 35,000 feet, its performance declined sharply. At 40,000 feet, the Mustang was simply no longer competitive, its speed falling far below that of the German Interceptor. British designs told a similar story. Late-war aircraft such as the Spitfire Mark 21, powered by the powerful Griffon engine, were formidable at most combat altitudes. Yet even in their best configurations, they lagged well behind the Ta-152 H-1 the upper stratosphere. The Hawker Tempest V, one of the fastest piston fighters ever built, excelled at low altitude but fell out of contention entirely as altitude increased. Only one Allied piston engine fighter came close to challenging the Ta-152 H-1, where it mattered most, the P-47M Thunderbolt. With immense power and robust construction, it could match or even exceed the Ta-152 speed below 30,000 feet. However, its reliance on short-duration boost systems meant it could not sustain peak performance. In a prolonged high-altitude engagement, endurance favored the German aircraft. Jet fighters complicate the picture. The Gloster Meteor and P-80 Shooting Star were faster in absolute terms, but their operational use was limited. The Meteor was largely restricted from flying over enemy territory, and the P-80 arrived too late to influence the European air war. Even then, there existed altitude bands where the Ta-152 H-1 could still outrun early jets, underscoring how advanced its design truly was. In the end, Allied analysts viewed the Ta-152 H-1 not as a game-changing weapon, but as a technical warning. It demonstrated how far piston engine technology could be pushed, and why the future would belong to aircraft that no longer depended on propellers at all. When the war in Europe ended, the Focke-Wulf Ta-152 H-1 faded almost as quickly as it had appeared. Fewer than 100 were built. Fewer still ever flew operational missions. Of those, only 2 survived the chaos of defeat. One cut apart for scrap, the other preserved in storage, unseen by the public. For an aircraft that represented the peak of piston engine fighter design, its physical legacy is almost invisible. And yet, its historical legacy is unmistakable. The Ta-152 H-1 proved that piston engine fighters had not yet reached their technological ceiling. With its high aspect ratio wing, pressurized cockpit, and layered approach to power generation, mechanical, chemical, and aerodynamic, it showed how altitude itself could be weaponized. Long before such ideas became standard, the Ta-152 treated the upper atmosphere as a combat environment rather than a limitation. But history is shaped as much by timing as by ingenuity. The Ta-152 H-1 was built to counter bombers that never arrived and to fight battles that were already shifting beyond the reach of propellers. By 1945, air combat was entering a new age. Jet engines removed the very constraints that the Ta-152 had been designed to overcome. Speed and altitude would soon come not from complexity, but from simplicity: thrust instead of superchargers, oxygen-rich exhaust instead of chemical injection. Operationally, the Ta-152 H-1 achieved little. Records suggest only a handful of victories, achieved under desperate circumstances against overwhelming odds, but that should not diminish its significance. In a collapsing industrial system, with shortages of fuel, materials, and trained pilots, creating an aircraft of such refinement was an extraordinary achievement. The true lesson of the Ta-152 H-1 is not about victory or defeat. It is about the limits of specialization in war. A machine perfectly adapted to a narrow problem can be breathtakingly effective, yet still irrelevant, if the battlefield changes faster than doctrine can adapt. Today, the Ta-152 H-1 stands as a quiet marker at the end of an era. It was the last, most extreme expression of the piston engine fighter, one final climb into thin air before aviation moved on forever. If this story raises a question for you, consider this. Had the air war over Europe lasted another year, and had bombers truly operated at extreme altitude, would the Ta-152 H-1 have rewritten its own legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you value deep, careful analysis of military history, consider joining us for the next chapter.